Please welcome NCSC's Head of the Office of the CTO, Helen Lovekin, and DCIT's Senior Policy Advisor on Software Security, Lorna Kirkby.
Welcome. I'm Helen Lovekin from NCSC.
And I'm Lorna Kirkby from DCIT.
And we have the pleasure of co-chairing today's panel, in which we'll explore how we partner internationally on software security to have the shared impact we crave, but in the timescales we need. Yes, but now. That was a quote from Peter Beagle's book, The Last Unicorn, that our director, China Mission and GCHQ left us with recently. They said that because the threat is very real, it's acute in places, and we need to take swift action. We know that action needs international partnership. None of us can do it on our own. Software security is a global challenge. We are an international community that needs to come together to shift a whole system. And we heard that this morning as well in the international panel that John chaired. Since the beginning of time, our geography, our rivers, mountains, deserts, lakes, and seas have constrained and shaped our global politics. But technology changes that. It overcomes distance, it's unaffected by terrain, and it's often instant. Those boundaries that have traditionally molded the way each nation approaches the same problem arguably need to be removed. So given the ubiquity of software and connectivity, our exposure is rapidly growing, and with that, so do the stakes when vulnerabilities are exploited. But trivial or unforgivable vulnerabilities, some of which have been around since the 70s, still exist, and are repeatedly exploited by people who have a low level of adversary tradecraft. Judging technology efficacy is a real problem. Buyers can't tell good software from bad. Claims often don't meet reality. And as Ollie puts it, we know more about what's in our sausages than in our software. Technology producers, be they shipping product to customers or running software as a service, can contract away liability for the most part.
And to start addressing the issues that Helen just described, yesterday we launched the Software Security Code of Practice. This code of practice communicates the core actions that all software vendors should take to solidify a minimum level of security and resilience across our software supply chains. It outlines 14 measures that organizations should take to ensure that software is secure by design and developed using secure development practices, that build environments are protected, that software is distributed securely and adequately maintained, and that suppliers communicate effectively with their customers around risks and incidents. This is part of the UK government's suite of voluntary codes of practice that set minimum standards for both organisational resilience and technology security. These include the new AI cybersecurity and cyber governance codes of practice that many of you would have heard about over the last couple of days. And together, these codify the baseline behaviours that should be embedded across the economy to provide a minimum level of protection to businesses and users. But the software security and other codes of practice are only the very first step in driving these improvements. Once minimum expectations are established, we must drive uptake and introduce accountability to encourage organisations to fulfil those expectations. As part of these efforts, the NCSC has also launched a new technology assurance regime, cyber resilience testing, which will provide buyers with more confidence in the technologies that they procure. So this is just the beginning of a journey, and as we move forwards, it's essential that we continue working with international partners. And this will ensure that we present powerful and consistent signals to industry and prevent these, what would be proportionate and achievable measures, from becoming burdensome through conflicting compliance processes. And today, we're lucky to have a fantastic panel to discuss how we can do just that. So without further ado, let's meet the panel.
like the whistles there. Someone had a fan club. So, welcome panel. I'm really excited to get into this discussion. So, we've set out the context. We've talked about what we've just launched. And we're going to go in right at the nub of the problem. Or maybe not. Maybe you've got a different angle on the situation. So, can I ask each of you to introduce yourselves? And I'd like to hear around a paragraph on your thoughts on, do we have a market problem or a technology problem? Or maybe a different problem. Irfan, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. It's a good question. The long answer is we've been through a bit of a journey. I think 5 years ago, I'd say we had a technology problem. I think if we said to companies that were producing technology or writing software, selling software, if we said, you know, can you make this secure by design, I think the answer would be, we don't know what that means. And I think over the last 5 years, we've gone on a journey to try to define, as you said in your introduction, Lorna, what good looks like and what we should be expecting. I think now, if we say to technology companies, we expect you to provide a minimum level of cybersecurity in your technology, I don't think it's legitimate to come back and say, we don't know what that means. So I think the technology problem has changed into a market problem, because now we have lots of guidance and we have these codes of practice and expectations, but I think awareness about them is quite low. So we have a problem on driving uptake, and I think the big issue we have when we talk to technology companies and people making this stuff is nobody's demanding this. The government isn't demanding it, our customers aren't demanding it, so why would we put investment into it? So that technology problem has become a market problem.
Yep.
I think the short answer is yes.
Both, yeah. Sarah, do you want to go?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Penman, the Director for Enterprise Information Security and the CISO at GCSB, which is the home of the NCSE in New Zealand. So I loved your answer, Irfan. I'm going to provide a similar answer and say it's both and. I think it's both a technology problem and a market problem, and I think we also need to consider the human element as people influence and are influenced by technology and the market. And so I guess with technology, we've seen, we know how complex it is, and we know that it's changing and evolving in complexity every day. We know how responsive and adaptive it is, and emerging technologies like AI and innovations can sometimes be surprising. So I guess yesterday we also talked about market incentives being so few, you know, it costs a lot to do good security, and the costs are then passed on to the consumer. And with those costs come risks, sometimes reputational. So I think we need to consider all of those three things together. I think divorcing one from the other might prevent us from seeing the whole problem. And I think that we also have the opportunity to see a more complete solution if we consider all of those things.
Thank you. Oltan, your turn.
Good afternoon. Alton Mulligan, Chief Services Officer from ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. Well, I certainly don't believe we have a technology problem. Perhaps that means that we have a market problem, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve fundamentally the same problem, and at least between countries and regions, there's no significant competitive advantage to being first or being better, because we're only as strong as the weakest link in this quite global industry. Where there is divergence, where there are different solutions, it's often because we're trying to solve the same problem, but in different rooms, in different fora, perhaps with different people in the room, and so naturally we come to somewhat slightly different solutions. So I think we need to pay more effort to convergence, to working together, to communication. And then, of course, that can perhaps help us with any market problems, with creating greater awareness of the needs and of the solutions that are available to this situation.
Lyle.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lyle King. I'm the Director of Risk Mitigation Programs at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Thank you, Trevor, for the whistle. I did not pay, but I feel like I've paid for it somehow. I think, you know, in terms of my thoughts, I was thinking about this, reflecting on the session yesterday, the market incentives, because I liked the way Ollie put it, that like we do know how to build secure technology, so I don't think that is the issue, and I think you're right, Irfan. There's been a lot of development and effort over the last few years, and I think we see that when we deal and discuss with vendors as well. So it does leave market as the other space, and I do think, you know, it is, consumers do want things that they're fast and functional. They want speed, and security sometimes gets in the way of that, I think. So, you know, how do you create a different signal of demand, I suppose, is the question. And I was thinking, again, I did like the analogy that was used yesterday with respect to health and safety and seat belts, and I know there was a bit of conversation about whether that was a good analogy or not. I think it is. Because, you know, cybersecurity is about health and safety, given the interconnectivity, reliance on technology for critical infrastructure, health. I was discussing these issues with somebody from NHS yesterday. So in a way, I'm thinking, well, what are other incentives there? Like for seatbelts, you know, they didn't just happen magically. There's regulation in that space as well. Do you need a nudge? Do we need more of a strong push and nudge in that space? So I guess I would put out there, I think, maybe there's still an element of a technology issue. I do think it's a market space, but maybe it's a regulation issue as well at the same time.
Great, thank you. Irfan, you've just mentioned the magic word secure by design, and a lot of global approaches to software security are based around the idea of secure by design. But what part of the overall security and resilience picture does secured by design play, and how can we ensure that there aren't any gaps around that? We'll come to Irfan first and then Sarah on that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I'll do is I'll do what I was supposed to do in the last question, which is introduce myself. So I'm Irfan Himani. I'm the Deputy Director for Cybersecurity and Resilience Policy, looking across the UK. And Lorna, what you just mentioned around secure by design is one of the central parts of how we are looking to kind of make the UK more secure online. So in the context of our recent kind of surveys on cybersecurity, I think around 40% of UK companies had some sort of a cyber attack in the last year. And we know that this stuff costs billions and billions to the UK economy. We haven't got an exact figure, but we know that it's draining the economy, and at some point soon it's going to cause threat to life. And so our approach to making the UK more secure is to reduce cyber risk at source through having secure by design technology, to ensure that organizations can manage that residual risk that they hold as organizations, uniquely as organizations, and then to have the skills and the cybersecurity sector that's able to work on the above two problems. Because if we as government demand things or request things from companies to be more secure, and we don't have the sector and the skills behind it, we're not really asking for anything, and we're not really going to get anywhere. So at the beginning, I talked about secure by design technology, and that's going to be crucial in our overall strategy. In the UK, we started looking at where we thought there was the highest risk, and given the rollout of Internet of Things devices in people's houses, we started there. So we have a national law in the UK that says any device sold to consumers in the UK has to have minimum cybersecurity requirements. I think it was one of the first of its kind in the world. That sits on, you know, the things that requires companies to do are not groundbreaking, right? These are basic cybersecurity things which everyone's known about for a while. But in order to have that law, we had to set the code of practice to say this is what we expect. That then went on to become an international standard, which we then use in legislation. As we then looked out across the kind of technology portfolio in the UK, we then started to say, okay, well, we also need to make sure apps are designed securely, and AI has cybersecurity thought in it. And recently, the software code of practice was released, or yesterday, the software code of practice were released. And these sort of suite of codes of practice help set that secure by design tone. Now, legislation has its role, Lyle, as you said. But we will only look to legislation where everything else has failed. So getting the market incentives right is going to be really important. But we will get to legislation if we need to on that. And then, you know, for organizations, we have things like, you know, where there is a threat to life or the threat of loss of billions and billions of pounds, we have legislation. So we have the UK's NIS regulations, and we've got the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill going into Parliament this year. And for everything else, and even for parts of that, we have Cyber Essentials. So we sort of have this clear portfolio of how we want the UK to, or what direction we want the UK to go in, and secure by design technology is pretty much the heart of it.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
Oh, well, again, a wonderful answer. It's hard to follow you. So secure by design is so fundamental, it's hard to pinpoint what part it plays in the overall picture. I do think it changes the conversation from risk to reward, and I do think it provides a solution to the supply chain problems that we're seeing. And the reason for that is that we know good design is good security. We know that the decisions that are made at the design phase are the best security decisions. And we can see how that evolves over the development of technology and a product into its life cycle and even towards decommissioning. So what I mean by from risk to reward is that, I guess at a basic level, if a product adopts secure by design practices and involves security at the outset, it can move faster later on. It's about velocity over speed. And so that provides an incentive for companies to do better because they can see how they can deliver more quickly through, say, a certification phase that would take a lot less time if you adopt secure by design practices. And they can then see how they can adopt better practices for the life of the product, such as continuous assurance and ease of patch management. And then at end of life, decommissioning becomes an easier question as well, which then allows us to address the problem of technical debt. So with better products, with better secure by design, and an understanding by the customer of what that means, there's more trust in those vendors that adopt those practices, and that then shifts the market incentive. If customers trust their vendor, trust is an advantage. It's a business advantage. It's an asset that should be protected. And that gives them a competitive edge. So in terms of gaps, how do we manage those gaps? I think there's a whole range of reasons, and I think the Software Security Code of Practice is one of those. Standardization and harmonization of standards is really important. And I also think that clarity of accountabilities is essential. So we can see that the Software Code of Practice does include responsibilities and accountabilities in it as a start point. And if you understand what you're accountable for at a very human level, you change your practices.
Absolutely. Did any of the other panelists want to come in on that before we move on?
Oh, well, I was going to follow on, in fact, on what Irfan was saying, but more or less, I think, which leads to the next question, which you were going to ask about.
Yeah, no, well, I was going to actually pick up on a couple of points that came out of that as well. So, Irfan, you mentioned sort of really understanding what the minimum standard is in our technology, and actually, I think the codes of practice are a great way to articulate that, and actually it provides a really consistent way in which we can articulate that. And then, Altan, you were talking about, are we solving the same problem or a different problem? And so my hypothesis is software security it's the same problem we're trying to solve across many, many different, the laws of physics are still there. They're all really quite similar. So actually, moving into that space of what does interoperability look like? How should we go about it? Is it about co-sealing? Is it about sort of international standards? Is it about mutual recognition? There's lots of different options, isn't there, when you come together? So Altan and then Lyle, how do you think we should go about this international collaboration?
Well, Irfan spoke about the approach in the UK, which is building guidelines and basically showing industry the path, encouraging them, but rather than trying to go directly to regulations. The European Union appears to be choosing to go more towards the path of regulation, especially with the Cyber Resilience Act, which is already in force, and most of the provisions will come in late 2027. So on the surface, it would appear that we've taken a divergent path, but in fact, if you look underneath the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, it's going to be based on standards, harmonized standards, and okay, those standards are currently being developed at ETSI, but if we look at who's developing them, well, we'll find quite a number of experts from throughout Europe, but not just European experts. We'll find a lot of delegates from the UK. We'll find people from NCSC. We'll find people from DCIT. We'll find the committee is actually chaired by somebody from the UK. And if we look at some of the fundamental technologies, or maybe not technologies, but approaches that are being taken in those standards, we'll find the same approaches as have come from the various different guidelines that have come out of the UK. You mentioned the cybersecurity guidelines, one of the very first one that became an ETSI technical specification of cybersecurity requirements for Internet of Things devices. We've recently published, I think last month.
33645 it was.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah. You know the number as well as I do. We have just last month published the cybersecurity requirements for AI, which came directly from
104223.
Yeah, exactly. It was inspired by work done in the UK. And I would hope to see the Software Security Code of Practice, or elements of it, being brought into ETSI, because in fact, some of the things that that is trying to resolve or trying to introduce into industry are issues or elements which also the Cyber Resilience Act wants industry to take up and deploy. The approach is regulatory rather than guidelines, but fundamentally underneath, it's the same thing. So I would say that before we get into maybe political discussions of mutual recognition of regulations versus guidelines and whatnot, let's start at least by working together in the standards committees, and it's not just in ETSI, it's also in SENS, NLEC, at ISO level, there's a huge amount of work being done there. Also in the US, we need to look at what's being done there as well. The experts know each other, they talk to each other, they communicate, they liaise. So let's at least try and harmonize the standards that are applicable in the various different regulatory regimes, so that at least industry doesn't have to meet different technical requirements, even if perhaps the administrative process of getting access to the market or not may be somewhat different. At least we can start with the same fundamental technical requirements. So as much as possible, base our work on international standards. It's okay to start quickly in one country, but then bring your work into an international standards body, like is being done in the UK with the work of NCSC and DCIT, which I could only strongly encourage.
I definitely agree. Coming together and producing that international standard is a great way to collectively sort of agree that. But is there actually some steps before that in terms of how countries work together in order to get that consistency? And I wonder, Lyle, I mean, in terms of Canada and the UK Software Security Code of Practice, can you see some potential next steps that might preempt international standardization?
Yeah, I'd been thinking about just interoperability more broadly speaking as well. And fundamentally, it's about just different systems being able to interact and work together. From a pure technology perspective, that's like data exchange, formats, protocols, which are all derived, should be derived from good, common, understood, international, hopefully, sometimes industry forum-led standards. So I think the starting point is, as you've said, Oltan, that. When it comes to products like the Software Security Code of Practice and other things, like what does it look like? Is it design? Is it cooperation? Mutual recognition? I think it can be all those things, I guess, and that's what I'm thinking about, sort of how we collaborate. I think we should be collaborating on multiple levels at the end of the day. Yeah. From a Canadian perspective, we've got a couple of really good programs that we work on. One jointly with our US counterparts in NIST, National Institute for Science and Technology, and that's the Crypto Module Validation Program. So it's a deep collaboration. You could say co-design in some ways and elements of that program. This is in and around looking at crypto modules that are part of IT products, making sure that they, again, apply to Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS. So the standard is there, and we've built up some process in and around that. And those are validated, and we issue joint certifications on a regular basis. So there's some, in a sense, mutual recognition from that front. That's one level. There's another common criteria recognition agreement is another, which gets into more kind of some sort of treaty level agreements internationally. There's about 30 countries involved in that CCRA program. But again, foundationally, it's about working from a standard base level, kind of like you said, Irfan. These are not like really high bars. This is about a very base level of security, functional, assurance requirements that need to be there in these products. And it's assessed as an assurance, but that program is specifically designed with mutual recognition in place. So it's about test once, available everywhere, so we can reduce sort of costs for ourselves. There's factors why you might want to buy into that and why you might not. It could be market-driven as well. And then circling back to the Code of Practice, it's a fantastic document. There's been other ones that we've looked at and we've co-sealed with, as many other organizations have, with CISA, the Secure by Design, Secure by Default, and our Australian counterparts put out a really great product a few months back on for sort of people looking to buy sort of trusted, secure, and verifiable technologies. So I think that the Code of Practice just introduces another tool, and for me, it's a toolkit.
Yep.
So from a Canadian perspective, we're not the biggest nation. Well, maybe land mass, we're pretty close, but population-wise, GDP-wise, we're pretty good, but there's countries that are bigger and smaller than us. We have to make decisions. Yep. So it can depend on resources, it can depend on legal and policy limitations as well as to how far you can go with a certain angle on things. But I think the Software Security Code of Practice is a fantastic tool for us. And for me, I can use it actively in my job. I can point to that now when I'm talking to vendors. I can introduce that, potentially into procurement security contract clauses. Say, I want to see some demonstration to these principles in your thing. So for me, the next step for me, while we sort of continue to look at it, can we refine it over time and learn lessons from a fluid market that does change and understand the pressures that are there for producers. Yep. But it's really about, it's pointing to this, sharing it, and really using it in an active way.
Yep, using it in practice, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Sarah, I want to come to you as well. So from a New Zealand perspective, what does good interoperability look like, and what's the best way in terms of cooperation that you think would really work, especially in software security space?
Well, I think interoperability for New Zealand is essential. We're a very small nation, and we're a disproportionate beneficiary of international standards, research, and guidance. But in saying that, we also have an important role to play, and we've got a unique perspective by virtue of our geographic location in the Pacific, and we have got a strong brand. And so we really need to work to strong suit, and I think the same could be said of all nations, really. We don't want to be duplicating efforts across nations. We want to be aligning those efforts and working to our unique strengths. I think in terms of mutual recognition, co-sealing, co-design, cooperation, all of those things work to enhance interoperability because they speak to trust. And so in my experience of working with my partners across the globe, we've done that based on a real strong trust. And so we're kind of at risk of a catch-22. You need trust to build interoperability, and you need interoperability to build trust here. But I think it's important to start somewhere, and all of those activities build that trust base. In New Zealand, we are really proud to co-seal products and have done so on a couple of occasions with partners. And I think in doing so, that lends confidence to users in New Zealand and more broadly as well. So it's a really important effort. We are discerning about which products we co-seal, and that's important for us because our stakeholders will then, invest their trust in us.
Thanks, Sarah.
And I think, Irfan, did you want to come in?
I did, yeah. I was getting really excited about all this talk of international cooperation and tried to jump in. I think it happens at all levels. So Lorna actually led the work on the Software Code of Practice, and I think for us, and when you did that, I think you started off with an international range of partners, right? This wasn't just about UK companies, because that's not really a thing in technology. You can have technologies from a company, but they're only going to go so far into your market, and actually these companies are everywhere. So having companies from everywhere be involved in the design is really important. But Sarah, you keep talking about trust, and it's incredibly important because you know, what all of this technology lets us do is live better lives. It allows for, you know, economic growth, it allows for better health, it allows for better societies, and we want all of that stuff. And sometimes we think, I think there's a bit of a, you know, there is that tension, but all of this is in the aid of, we want technology to be out there. And for technology to be out there, and for the investment that it needs, and for it to take the shape that we want it to, there has to be that trust from society. And that trust relationship is going to look different in New Zealand to Canada to the UK. So every country is going to, and this is quite right, find its own route to build that trust relationship between technology and consumer. In the EU, that might be regulation. In the UK, that might not be regulation. But as you said, Ultan, it's, you know, if all companies know what the universe of minimum standards looks like, it doesn't really matter if one country is regulating and another is having it as a procurement requirement, another as a recommendation, because they're the same 10, 13 things that you need to do. And so having that kind of that thread throughout of this is an international problem and we need to be looking at this from an international perspective means that you can then have that. And you can make this easy for companies. I mean, a lot of the time we talk about cybersecurity, we're thinking about this is going to be hard for companies. We can make it much easier for companies by having the same set of things that you have to point to maintain that trust between consumer and government and technology.
Absolutely, and I think a couple of the industry partners that we worked with in the co-design might be in the room, so big thank you to you if you are here. I can't see anyone with the lights. But Ultan, you spoke really eloquently about the need for international collaboration on standards and how they can be used to working towards regulations. But are there any other ways that we can leverage standards and help drive uptake of them and introduce market incentives and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. I think even if we consider the approach taken by the European Union, the Cyber Resilience Act, as a regulatory approach, I think many in this room would argue quite rightfully that's probably not enough. I mean, it's just covering the bare minimum set of essential requirements. If I look at what is, okay, it's already happening to some extent in the cybersecurity industry, but perhaps we should look at voluntary certification schemes, which of course can still be standards-based, which create a level of consumer or popular awareness around security, a labeling scheme, but with teeth, with a meaning behind it. Perhaps it may have to be sector-specific. For example, the mobile industry already has certification, but voluntary certification around mobile devices, because to place a mobile device on the market, it doesn't actually have to work, connect to the network. It just, from a regulatory perspective, it just shouldn't excessively use the spectrum. But of course, no network operator will sell through its stores or will subsidize a mobile device which has not passed this voluntary certification scheme. There's 2 or 3 such ones throughout the world. Now, they're not popularly known by the general public, but they're just blanket certification schemes for the industry. You can't really sell a mobile device without having gone through this. No one will buy it from you. Perhaps we need something similar for different sectors. It could start with the mobile industry for secure mobile devices, but also for other IoT consumer-connected devices. Perhaps other similar security schemes or labeling schemes for other industrial sectors, to make it more of a marketing and selling point, and coming back to the point that you made in the beginning about is it a market or a technology problem, to try and generate a real market and an added value for those who wish to comply with a higher level of cybersecurity, and give them a real selling point on that, and make it simple and visible to consumers or to customers that, and again, as we said earlier, build trust, because you need a trustworthy certification scheme, but it's not one that a consumer can be expected to go through line by line code or a list of standards applied or whatever, but a simple labeling scheme. We see this happening time and again in the technology industry. We should try and do the same for cybersecurity.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, do.
I do like pointing to things in my job as well, and I find it enormously useful when we're looking at procurement security to be able to point to standards, and I think that does shift, especially if you're a company that's trying to sell to government, which are big, big consumers as well. So I think we've been doing a lot of thinking about procurement security in Canada in our government space as well. So, to have standards set there in terms, go back to sort of procurement contract requirements and having those things embedded in there is good. It's a bit more formal, right, than what you're talking about all the time, but there's a good example of this, not specifically to Government of Canada procurement, but again, that crypto module validation program that I'm talking about, that is a requirement for the US federal government, or if you're going to sell to US federal defense industry, that you have to meet this FIPS 140-3 requirement. The stand's built on a standard, again. It's not a requirement in Canada, but we participate in that program because it facilitates the business of our Canadian companies into that US market. But now it's become sort of a de facto accepted space. So even though it's not required, people demonstrate that they've met it, or that that they will be meeting it. So I think it's a nice example of something where we tried to satisfy one space, but it's had a leveling up effect for the broader market when it comes to that space, and certainly in Canada and beyond as well. I think some international partners look to that certification as well. So it's a good example in practice of something that's built on international standard, some complicated processes and annoying certification processes that I know annoy vendors, but at the same time, it's lifted up that space.
Yeah. And like you say, it's something to point to. And that sort of chimes a little bit with what you were saying, Altan, as well, of actually, that the labelling scheme that we heard about in the previous plenary as well. It's really tangible, and it's amazing how popular and the take-up that we've seen there as well. So.
And as Lyle mentioned, government procurement or public procurement can actually be a good Kickstarter for, to create a demand behind such a scheme if one was launched. It needs to be, of course, not just national, it needs to be transnational across multiple countries, but nevertheless, it could still, initially create a market. Or like was explained yesterday morning for the Cyber Essentials program, large companies, I think it was the speaker from BAE, was saying that large companies insisting that their suppliers comply with Cyber Essentials, even if they're not coming from the UK, is a way to spread and almost enforce the scheme without any regulatory enforcement.
Yes, and that, Airfon was saying that earlier, wasn't it? That's the last resort. So what I'm hearing is that, that shared minimum standard that we all agree on, different ways in which it might manifest itself in different places, but that sort of international sort of standard that we all agree on. There is the option to add some questions on Slido, by the way, but we've got a couple here that I might ask. So one of the questions are, the priorities. Digital supply chain security is quite a big thing. What for Canada, New Zealand, Europe, UK? What are the priorities in terms of improving what's your digital supply chains? What comes first? How do we go about that, and how do we start prioritising next steps? What do you think? Anyone want to come in on that question?
That's a huge question.
It's massive, isn't it? Or I can reel off standards and Airfan can reel off the numbers. I mean, that's the alternative, yeah. But no. So priorities, digital supply chain. What do we think?
Any more standards? I'm at the end, right? Those are the two in the Secure by Design library for us. So I think supply chains has become, I think we used to talk about secure by design. We thought, actually, if we can secure our environment, if we can secure the technology, we're probably all right. That's absolutely not true, of course, and we've seen much of that in the last few years. I think in the UK, a lot of, where we're worried about threat to life and massive economic loss, that will be regulated, and to some extent it is at the moment. And the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill will look at supply chains, and so it will look at things like managed service providers and digital service providers as well. So companies of that scale and of that criticality will come under regulatory enforcement in the future as this bill progresses, or when this bill progresses. There's also there's also that level of what's below critical, but actually still fundamental to run. And for things like that, and we heard BAE Systems yesterday talk about this kind of thing, actually having something like Cyber Essentials in your supply chain, or making sure Cyber Essentials is throughout your supply chain, and that companies are using that, is an important route to kind of that supply chain assurance. If you are a big company and you have thousands of suppliers, receiving thousands of questionnaires about what a company is doing is just not going to be useful, and actually doesn't tell you that much. Going through something like Cyber Essentials and getting the certificate does tell you at least you've got these 5 basic things, and then you can add on top of that. But the software code of practice is going to be even more fundamental than that, because then we're talking, okay, we've got the critical companies regulated under, whatever requirements. We've got Cyber Essentials, but actually this stuff has to be secure by design in the first place.
Yep.
And so that sort of layered approach gives you sort of resilience in your approach to say, actually, if one fails, then you've got the other and the other, and that will hopefully build trust. Because I think now, as companies are looking down their supply chain, and it's still a very small proportion of companies that I think something like 23% of companies in the UK are aware of the risk posed to them by their supply chain. As that number gets bigger and bigger,
Yep.
Things like the software code of practice, Cyber Essentials, are going to become incredibly important tools to giving you that assurance.
Yeah, to navigate.
Yeah, I think, I'm approaching Canada. I guess I can go back to the legislation that almost was, in a sense. For us, we had a bill that had just about made it to the last mile, like a hair's breadth, and then Parliament was prorogued. But that was intended to create a critical cyber systems security act or protection act, and that was really to help with the creation of better cybersecurity for regulated sectors, so in transport, finance, energy, and telecommunications. And we've had roles. That's hitting that sort of critical infrastructure space as well. So, I mean, it's still, generally speaking, a priority, right, in terms of level of effort to work with those sectors. And there's, different levels of maturity within those sectors as well. That's sort of one piece. And then supply chain, more broadly speaking, like I dream and have nightmares about supply chain now. It's I think all I seem to talk about. But that's not a bad thing, because that means that we're trying to actively tackle that issue. And there's a number of ways we can do it. We're doing it within government to improve processes, but it's education. We work with industry partners through a joint initiative with our Ministry of Information Science and Economic Development. So there's an active, government and private sector engagement. How do we look at that critical digital infrastructure and protect those supply chains? So that's really, really important to learn from that. And I think the challenge is very much that layer of small and medium enterprises and businesses. It's a much smaller percentage of the big companies and a massive percentage of small, medium enterprises. How do you help those spaces? There was one other thing I was going to say, and I completely forget what that was. But it was a really good point.
We're doing excellent.
I'll circle back to it.
Come back to it. Oltan,
I know what it was, actually. Sorry. Sorry if I could just speak. Another thing is just sort of in terms of the advice and guidance, which hits broadly speaking. It's meant at first to hit sort of critical infrastructure partners, but can be used much like the software security code of practice for others. Is cyber resilience goals that we have. So really sort of mapping out for companies, entities, individuals, the different things they need to be thinking about and components underneath different categories. It all maps over to like NIST, CSF 2.0 framework. So it's a repeatable, usable, and familiar thing for people. But just having, I think, simple guidance as well and giving the pointers to educate is really important. So we try to hit for the important critical infrastructure sectors, but then make sure that message is also broadened out to the rest of the population.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's fine. Altan.
I wanted to say something that when we talk about supply chain, we tend to think about customer-supplier relationships and contractual relationships and whatnot. But there's also the software supply chain, knowing what's in your software, where it came from. And I was just speaking there before lunch to an exhibitor who's dealing with software bills of material. That's going to become a very important part of compliance with the European Union's Cyber Resilience Act regulation. Because nobody builds an application or a piece of software from ground up, from A to Z today anymore. You always incorporate libraries from various different components, sometimes open source, sometimes commercial. And so you really need to be able to know, because you're responsible if you place a product on the market, you're responsible for the software in that product. So you take responsibility for all of the components that you've brought in from everywhere else. And that then opens up another question about what about all the critical, essential open source components, software components which are widely used, which are no longer maintained. Because nobody's paying the developer who wrote this software 10, 15 years ago to continue to maintain it. Now, I know that's on quite a number of companies' radars. It's on political radar. I presume it is in the UK. It certainly is in Europe. It certainly is in the US. But it's going to bring that topic even more into light. So please don't forget this.
Absolutely. And Sarah, very briefly, before I can see we're coming up to time almost, so just New Zealand, next steps sort of.
Sure, I suppose, would you like a next steps for us? Or
Yeah, just a 30 seconds on what do you think your priorities and next steps might be?
Well, I guess it's very difficult to summarize in 30 seconds, but it's also very difficult to prioritize. And so what we have an initiative that, several initiatives tucked under a banner of the basics are built in. And so that really does speak to building in the basics as early as possible in the supply chain. It's a really important set of initiatives for our country.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Great, so we're coming up to time now. As we kind of finish, one last point on the Software Security Code of Practice. Irfan, did you want to touch on what the next steps for the UK will be?
Yeah, so the Software Security Code of Practice I have here,
Nice infographic.
just to make sure I know what's in it. But I think now it's around, like with all of our guidance and all of our codes of practice, is driving uptake. I think for our oldest and most established scheme in the UK, Cyber Essentials, I think it's only around 20% of companies actually know what that is. And so bringing out new stuff complicates the market. So step one is going to be driving awareness of this code of practice, all of our codes of practice. For this one specifically, I think one of the things that codes of practice brings is you can measure against it, it's consistent, and it's usable kind of internationally. And so getting other countries to work with us on this, getting this into maybe standards bodies like Ultan was talking about, and actually having that assurance framework that sits around it that companies can then use to show that they are meeting the requirements, and then use that as a way to build trust and have that market advantage is probably where we're going with that. But you're going to tell me if I'm wrong.
No, that's absolutely. Big ambitions here.
Big ambitions. Right. So in the last minute, any further points from the panel that you wanted to make in terms of your next steps and what's on the horizon?
I think from my perspective, the one thing I wanted to say is that the doors are wide open in standardization bodies like ETSI and other international standards bodies for UK delegates. There's a wealth of cybersecurity expertise in this country, and the UK has led and leads and can continue to lead that work, both government representatives through NCSC and DCIT and others, and also industry. So definitely keep continuing that.
Canada?
Yeah, I would say I would double down on that in terms of industry involvement. That's really crucial, whether it's through international or sector-driven forums, because we need to understand what they're dealing with and contend with. So involvement, get in. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you to our wonderful panel. It's been a rich discussion, some great next steps, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Please scan the QR code to evaluate this session.